as they go, and certainly not as a sigh of relief, I want you to breathe in really big, let it out. Do that again, but this time inhale with your nose. You smell anything? Maybe you're like, oh, I forgot to put deodorant on today. Hopefully not. Our sense of smell is an amazing feature of our body that God kind of inserted in us, and it's magnificent. Can I talk to you about smells? First thing, smells, it's funny because one person could smell the same thing as another, but the first could be repulsed by it, and another might be attracted by it. For instance, I happen to like the smell of skunk. Now, I realize I'm a bizarre individual. That's one reason why. Most of you probably don't like the smell of skunk, but seriously, I really do. It's not bad. It's kind of sweet. Anyway, see, so the same smell might drive some people away and might kind of lure others in, okay? Smell is funny like that. Here's some other facts about smell that fascinated me. I think you'll think they're pretty cool, too. First of all, people can detect over 1 trillion scents. People can detect over 1 trillion different scents. It's amazing. Smell is the most sensitive of our senses, and women happen to have a better sense of smell than men, which makes me kind of smirk because it's funny that they still choose to have a relationship with us, though we might smell different. And then also, each human has their own distinct odor. Again, and wives probably are nudging their husbands like, yeah, tell me about it. See, men, their favorite scent, statistically anyway, their favorite scent is, what do you think? Man's favorite scent, what? It's breakfast, cooking breakfast. You fill in the blank with what breakfast is, sausage, gravy, and egg, this one. Women's favorite scent, statistically, is the scent of a newborn baby. Smell happens to be the first scent to develop. As our bodies are forming inside our mothers, scent is the first. It's fully functional, and it's fully developed before birth, even. It's the only sense fully functional then. And also smell is the sense most linked with our emotional recollection. Okay, it evokes memories, right? You know that. You know that. You can think of your grandma's house or so-and-so's smell, and even though you can't smell it, like you can, right? It's created a memory. So scents evoke memories like that. Most of your scent memories are formed in your first decade of life. And one interesting fact about that, the scent of Crayola crayons in 85% of people evokes memories of their childhood. If you go home today and start sniffing your crayons, you might think of your childhood, but now you will because I told you that. Hopefully not. So try it when you forget. People actually can remember smells with 65% accuracy a year after they smelled that smell. That memory, that event is triggered with 65% accuracy. They can identify that smell. Whereas what we see, we forget over half of it just 3 months after we see it. And finally, this is a little interesting tidbit, which we'll come to in a few minutes. When things like perfume are applied to hair, they have a hold that's stronger than normal. They have a longer lasting smell. Their smell lingers longer when it's applied to hair. Holds that thought. So, if you would, wonder with me about this power of smell. If smell is so very powerful and evocative and emotional, if you were God, wouldn't you work that scent of smell into how we engage with you as God, right? I mean, if it's such a powerfully persuasive, memorialized tool, wouldn't God kind of mix that into the way that we relate to him? I think so, but maybe you're guessing how. Well, think with me about the Old Testament. If you've read a little bit of the Bible, when they would offer sacrifices to God, they would cook parts of the animals. There was cooking meat. Other times they would offer oils or wines or grains or incense. So the places they did this, it was called the tabernacle and the temple, was one stinky but smelly place. Right? It would be, if you went to the temple, I'd imagine it would be a mix of kind of Piggy's Barbecue and like the fragrance department at Macy's, kind of all at once. It was a very smelly endeavor to worship God then. In fact, over and over in the Old Testament, when there was a sacrifice offered, God said, that's a soothing aroma. That's a pleasing smell to me. So then go to the New Testament, and we read things like this in Ephesians 5. Jesus' sacrifice for our sins is called a fragrant offering. And then, in fact, it applies to us. 2 Corinthians 2 says, now he uses us to spread the knowledge of Christ everywhere like a sweet perfume. Our lives are a Christ-like fragrance rising up to God, it says. See how God has designed us to engage with him in these sensory ways? So, if you would sniff out with me how that might be through a really pungent story in the New Testament. In fact, I think if all of the scents of the Bible could somehow be contained in the pages of your Bible, when you opened it, I think the smell we're about to read about would be the most striking. I think it would rise to the top above all the others. So if you would turn to Mark 14, you could also read the same story in Matthew 26 or in John 12. I'll be kind of referring to some things that John tells us in John 12. But Mark 14 is a great place to start and to camp out this morning. So inhale deeply and hold on to your noses. John tells us that in days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. And Mark 14:3 says, this all took place in the home of Simon the leper. Now we know that from John that the woman we're about to read about is named Mary. Mary was Martha's sister and Lazarus' sister. And we know how much she loved Jesus. She loved spending time with him. In fact, when he came through town, and that was kind of the last stop on the way to Jerusalem, you can see a map, but Bethany's right next to Jerusalem. It was the last stop before the big city. Jesus would stay there frequently, it seemed like, and Mary just loved spending time with him. She would put off her chores. She would put everything to the side just to spend time with Jesus and sit at his feet and hear what he had to say. She loved Jesus. And that's where this story takes place. This story takes place around a dinner table. It was called a triclinium. It had like these three, kind of like a horseshoe-shaped setup, and you would lay on your side, on your left side, and eat food with your right. That was called reclining at table. So what we're about to read, Mark 14, happens around the dinner table with lovely friends, people who just thought Jesus was the best ever. In fact, think about who's there for a second. You've got Lazarus, who was dead and now is alive because Jesus called him out of the grave. And this takes place in the home of Simon the leper. We don't know anything about him, but my guess is Jesus healed him from leprosy. So there's two guys already who were like brought back from the dead by Jesus. You can imagine the things they're talking about. I mean, if I were there, I'd be like, Lazarus, dude, what's the other side look like? Did you see Great Aunt Ruth? Did you see Moses? Like, what's it look like to come back, right? The conversation, there's this enthusiasm and excitement in the air. Jesus is there, his disciples, probably the whole town of Bethany was kind of there in the wings. I mean, this is an exciting place to be at this dinner table, except for one guy. Now, Jesus loved the company, but his heart was heavy. He'd been telling those that followed him, he said, look, not too long from now, I'm going to be handed over and killed. He knew it, but he was the only one in that room who got it, it seemed like. Everybody else is high-fiving it. Yeah, Jesus is here. Dude, look at Lazarus. Jesus felt this crushing weight growing in his soul because he was just days away from laying down his life, facing excruciating agony. That's where we get the word excruciating, from crucifixion. Jesus knew the agony that was facing him just days away, and it's like nobody else knew it. Have you ever been in a spot like that where, man, your soul was just crushed, your heart was so heavy? Or maybe you saw something looming ahead that was certain, and it terrified you, or it just crushed you, but nobody else knew that. It was just inside. It hurts enough to be there, but it hurts even more when you face that alone, doesn't it? Cool part about this story that we'll see is that there was one person maybe who did get it, who wasn't leaving Jesus alone in the pain he was already feeling. So let's head back to the dinner table. And Mark 14:3 says this. While he was in Bethany reclining at the table in the home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. I brought some perfume with me. Nard was very, very rare, very hard to get. It was derived from a plant in the Himalayas in India, so hence it was very expensive. The jar that Mary broke was an alabaster jar. You can see a picture of it there. Contained a pint of this nard perfume, according to John. And she broke it to pour it on Jesus. Maybe she broke it because that's how you had to open the jar. Sometimes they were sealed shut. Maybe she broke it as a way of showing to Jesus that this was all for him. She wasn't going to use it in any other way. Almost like in sports, you retire the jersey of someone who played so well so that no one will wear that number again. Maybe this was Mary's way of saying, this is all for you. We know in a little bit that we're going to read that it cost her or her family somewhere along the line tons of money to acquire this perfume. She poured it all out for Jesus. What she did showed three things that I want to look at more deeply. First, it showed that Jesus, in Mary's eyes, was of inestimable worth and value. Showed the great value Jesus had in Mary's eyes. And second, it was a demonstration of her total devotion to Jesus. And then lastly, it was Mary's way, whether she knew it or not, of showing that she was with Jesus. She got him. She was going to walk with him wherever that led him. In this case, it would lead him to the cross. Let's look more at why it means those things, this sacrifice for Mary. You know, it's kind of cool. Alabaster jars were discovered hundreds of years after by archaeologists way back when. And some of them still had the scent of the fragrance that was in them. It's strong, especially the nard scent, very strong perfume. So this gift showed the inestimable value of Jesus to Mary. But look at what happens in verse 4. Read what these guys say. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages and the money given to the poor." And they rebuked her harshly. You know, literally it means they were snorting like angry horses. These guys who followed Jesus were now criticizing Mary for what she did. You know, the disciples are real mathematicians too. No, not knocking mathematicians. But they were always calculating stuff. Right? One time Jesus was going to feed a crowd, big crowd, 5,000 or more people, and the disciples are like, hey, that would take 200 days' wages just to feed these folks. Well, we know that the perfume Mary poured out was 300 days' wages, so they're thinking, okay, if it costs that much, wow, this could feed like 7,500 people, Jesus. Imagine the feeding program you could have. Man, you could have full-time employees. You could change the whole community if you just didn't pour it out on the ground. Come on, Mary, what? Why the waste? 1 year's wages, I don't know quite what it was then, but the median yearly annual wage of a man in Long Valley is $76,000. If I had $76,000, I wouldn't buy a bottle of perfume, and I don't think I'd pour it out. Mary did. A year's wages poured out. Now, it was customary during Passover to give gifts to poor people, kind of as a way of, they experienced God's rescue and deliverance, and so they would pass it on to others who were in need. And during Passover, that was common. So I wonder if the disciples were thinking, Mary, like of all the times, you should have sold, if you wanted to get rid of this nard, you could have sold it, you could have blessed all these people. Maybe they were thinking selfishly, you could have included us in your gift, then we wouldn't have to give either. I don't know, right? They criticized her. They actually scold her and rebuke her. I bet Mary hadn't thought of what others would say about this offering to Jesus because she was, you could say, blinded by love. Not romantic love, but the kind of love where, like, he gave her back her brother from the dead. And he gave meaning, enrichment to her life. Like, when he talked, everything made sense, and nothing made sense outside of him, right? For Mary, Jesus was completely valuable. He was worth it. And I bet she didn't think people would scold her for demonstrating that by giving up this perfume. One of the commentators named William Barclay says about this story, there's a recklessness in love that refuses to count the cost. There's a recklessness in love that doesn't count the cost. Her eyes were fixed on Jesus, but the disciples are so rude to her. And they're not just rude to Mary, they're rude to Jesus. Like, did you see what they said? Okay, they said, "Why this waste?" In Jesus' hearing, as Mary's pouring it out, they say, "Mary, don't waste the perfume on Jesus." That's what they're saying, right? Maybe, it was customary to put a couple drops of scented oil on guests as they came in, especially at a dinner like this. So maybe they're thinking, Mary, like, hold up, all right? Jesus is a 2 or 3 drop worthy person, but not the whole jar, Mary. What's your Jesus worth? I mean, I had to ask myself that as I read. I said to Jesus and to Mary, this is a waste. But to Mary, he was worth it all. There's no value you could put on Jesus. What's your Jesus worth? It's interesting to see where this story leads in the context here, and in John, the book of John too. Look at verses 10 and 11 in Mark 14. After this happens, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. See, it's almost like this event of generous love, extravagant love, pushed Judas over the edge. He couldn't handle such extreme generosity. It was too radical, and he was going to go find his own money. Mary poured out $76,000 in a gift to give love to Jesus. Judas would give up the love of God for what equated to $600 in silver. What's your Jesus worth? Such huge displays of love can sometimes push other Christians away. It stinks, but it's true. I wonder if even some of you need to ask yourselves if others' demonstrations of love towards God, maybe in their time of worshiping together, maybe some other time, if their displays of love towards God, their way they're worshiping God, if it bothers you, maybe you should ask yourself why. Evangelist and preacher Ray Pritchard says about this story too, if your faith never causes you to do something that others question or get upset about, maybe you're playing it too safe. See, when we radically love Jesus, it bothers some people who also say they love Jesus. But check out what Jesus says to these grumbling disciples. Look at verse 6. He says, "Leave her alone. Why are you bothering her? She's done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want. But you will not always have me." There's this opportunism to faith. Sometimes you have to do something radical like that, whether nobody sees it, whether everybody sees it. What the disciples called waste, Jesus called beautiful. Some of you know me, and you know how I try to live frugally. Most of you would call me a cheapskate, and that's true. I'm worthy of that description. I would have been with the disciples. I know it. I'm a jerk, but I would have been. I would have been like, Mary, no, come on. You could have done so much with that. But Jesus just praised her, said thanks. He didn't see it as a waste. He didn't see it as a missed opportunity to do something else. Like if you give God this, well, you can't give it to these people. God's not weighing either or. He says, you love me? Pour it on. He's okay with that. By the way, you'll have a chance to show public love by serving others in that CSI event, October 22nd. You'll find out more, but there might be a chance that you can show what love looks like in a way even that others might get to see. So Mary valued Jesus, and that's what the perfume showed. It also showed her devotion to Jesus. Look at verse 8. Her total devotion to Jesus. Jesus just says this, she did what she could. She did what she could. Literally, those words say, what she had, she did. What she had, she did. Well, let's look at what Mary had. What did she do? What did she give? She had her perfume, her expensive perfume. She had a reputation, which she was totally willing to risk if she even thought about that. Right? I mean, as a woman, you wouldn't, in that day, you wouldn't approach a man, especially a rabbi like this, and then you wouldn't let your hair down. You wouldn't, do all the stuff she was doing and touching his feet and head. No, like all of that, social faux pas, socially outrageous. You wouldn't do that. Mary had no problem giving up any kind of reputation she had. And speaking of hair, The Bible actually says this kind of mysterious saying. It says the glory of a woman is in her hair. And so maybe in letting her hair down, it's like she's giving Jesus her glory, whatever that means, right? She's giving it all to Jesus. That's a good challenge for us, too. It's a good challenge for me. What she had, she did. What do you have? What could you do? Typically, our response is, I can't get whatever you're thinking, or I can't give that much. You know, the truth is we could, we just don't want to sometimes. And I think looking at Mary's example, we have to ask ourselves why. Sometimes maybe a better question is not, how much do I give, but how much do I hold back from God or for me? And these are tough questions, but they're there, right? You see them too. I mean, we have to ask ourselves these things. What do I have? What could I do? God asks us, what do you have? Because that's what he'll use. Not what you'll have one day, or what you have when you'll retire, or what you'll have in 10 years, or when you graduate, or pass this class for the third, whatever. What do you have now, here, before him? What could you do? And then finally, Mary showed, through pouring this perfume out on Jesus, she showed that her heart was bound with Jesus's, no matter where it led him. Look at the rest of verse 8. Jesus says, she poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. It's so cool. Remember how Jesus is feeling now. Everybody's celebrating, high-fiving, Lazarus is back, Simon's okay, great dinner, it's free. But Jesus has this heaviness in his heart because he knows the cross awaits him just a few days away. It's a terrible feeling to feel pain and feel it alone, but someone entered his pain. Now, I'm not sure if Mary knew what she was doing was this kind of prophetic way of showing that Jesus was going to die, because a good Jewish person would be anointed and they'd put perfume on the body the day they died. If you died in that day, you're Jewish, you would die, they would embalm you, and they would bury you that day. When Jesus died on the cross, it was during Passover, it was this high holy day, and so they just didn't have the time to put perfume and stuff like that on him. They just had to get him in the tomb. So the only anointing Jesus had before his death, or even after his death, was here. If you remember when the women came to anoint him with oil 3 days after he died, he was already alive again. No one but Mary put perfume on Jesus before his death. Now, maybe she knew that. Maybe she was so close to Jesus, she seemed to get him, and she certainly loved hearing him. Maybe she understood. She connected the dots, and when she poured the perfume on, she was saying in this act that, I know where you're going. I know it leads to death, and so I'm doing this. But maybe she didn't. Maybe it was this whimsical, spontaneous act of love. Either way, God says it served the purpose of anointing Jesus' body for burial. It was this prophetic way, whether she knew it or not. And remember earlier when I said that perfume, when it's applied to your hair, has a stronger hold. It lasts longer. I've experienced that. Last year, I think it was last year or the year before, my kids got into my wife's perfume in the room. And of course, because this has to happen this way, they found the most expensive perfume she had from Bermuda. You could only get it and they poured it all over our son, one of our sons. For days, he smelled very fragrant, like a kick in the teeth fragrant, and we gave him baths and washed. It didn't come out. It was in his hair. Now, John tells us that Mary poured the perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped the excess off with her hair. And Mark says that she poured it on his head, too. So Jesus has this nard perfume worth $76,000 dripping down his hair, and Mary has it on her hair. Jesus is just days away from being whipped, beaten, mocked, and killed on the cross. I smelled in my own home many days after it was applied. I am quite sure that as Jesus was being beaten and mocked and bleeding and dying on the cross, that he caught wisps of nard because it was in his hair. And the only person in the universe who could experience that with him was Mary, who had it in her hair. Why? Because she chose to pour it all out for Jesus. A couple drops wouldn't do. Whatever it cost her, it was worth it. He was that valuable to her. She was that devoted to him. And in the sovereignty of God, I don't know if Mary knew it or not, God was using her to point Jesus to the cross and prepare him for that process. And she got him in his pain before he even entered into it. What's your Jesus worth? How many drops is he worth? You know, the cool part, it ends, Jesus says, you know, what she did is going to be told everywhere you talk about me. Whenever you say what Jesus did, you're going to talk about what Mary did. Why? Because she acted out the gospel, the good news that Jesus saves. I mean, think about it. The disciples were upset that she poured out so much worth of perfume. Think about what God gave. Romans 5:8 says, God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we are still sinners, Christ died for us. The godly one for the ungodly, to bring us to God. Talk about excessive. Talk about wasteful. The life of the perfect, righteous, holy God who's never been tainted by sin or evil, being killed in our place, who deserve every ounce of punishment. That's excessive. That's too good to even be fair. We should cry out against God. That's too excessive. But he said, Mary did what that means. What Mary did is a picture of what I'm about to do. Pour it all out for love for us. When she did that, some scoffed. But Mary and God on high praised what happened there. Was her gift too extravagant? No. It was appropriate. In the view that Mary had of Jesus, this was even a cheap gift. If she had gallons and drums of this nard, she would have poured them all out for Jesus. He was worth it. It wasn't extravagant to Mary, and it wasn't extravagant to God. What do you have? What could you do? How much is Jesus worth in our eyes?